There's an unspoken contract we all make when we step into a hospital or sit across from a doctor. We trust them with our lives. We bear our bodies, our symptoms, our fears, and we place ourselves entirely in their hands because we believe they've sworn an oath to do us no harm. But what happens when the person holding the syringe, the one reading your chart, the one smiling at your bedside, is the very reason people keep dying? These are the stories of medical professionals who turned their clinics, hospitals, and nursing homes into killing fields, and who did it for years without anyone stopping them. In the working-class town of Hyde, nestled in Greater Manchester, England, there was a doctor that most of his patients genuinely adored. His name was Harold Frederick Shipman, and for decades he was everything you could want in a family physician. He made house calls, he remembered your children's names, and he seemed to care deeply about the elderly who made up the bulk of his practice. One patient described the feeling of being accepted onto Shipman's patient list as being like winning the lottery. Another relative, even after learning that Shipman had murdered his father, couldn't reconcile the monster with the man, saying he remembered the time Shipman gave to his dad, and that he would come around at the drop of a hat, and that he was a marvelous GP, apart from the fact that he killed his father. That quote alone should tell you just how unimaginable Shipman's crimes were, even to the people closest to them. Harold Shipman was born on January 14, 1946, in Nottingham, England, the second of 4 children in a working-class family. His father was a lorry driver, and no one in his family had ever attended university. By all accounts, young Harold, known to most as Fred, was bright and driven, a quiet boy who did well in school and was an avid rugby player. But the defining moment of his early life came when he was just 17 years old, when his mother Vera was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. Vera had been the dominant force in Harold's childhood, a woman who instilled in him an early sense of superiority and who lifted him above his siblings as her favorite. Now she was dying, and the young Harold found himself glued to her side during the final months of her life, watching in something that could only be described as fascination as a doctor arrived at their home, rolled up his mother's sleeve, and injected her with morphine. The drug would ease her pain, relax her features, and for a brief window, give her some semblance of peace. Vera died on June 21, 1963, and Harold was devastated. But that image, the image of a doctor administering a substance that could both relieve suffering and bring death, never left him. 2 years later, he enrolled at Leeds University Medical School, where he was, by all accounts, entirely unremarkable. He met his future wife, Primrose Oxtoby, at a bus stop during his first year. They married in 1966 when she was just 17 and 5 months pregnant with their first child. The couple would go on to have 4 children. After graduating in 1970, Shipman took his first position at Pontefract General Infirmary before joining a group medical practice in Todmorden, a small town in West Yorkshire, in 1974. It was there that the first signs of trouble surfaced. Shipman began experiencing unexplained blackouts, which were initially attributed to epilepsy, but were later revealed to be symptoms of an addiction to the powerful painkiller pethidine. He had been forging prescriptions for the drug in the names of patients who never received it, stockpiling it for his own use. When confronted by his colleagues, he admitted to the addiction, was fined a relatively modest sum, and was sent off to a drug rehabilitation clinic near York. Despite this, the General Medical Council issued only a warning and did not strike him off the medical register. By 1977, Shipman had resurfaced in Hyde, joining the Donnybrook Medical Center as a general practitioner. It was here, in this quiet corner of Greater Manchester, that he would begin his decades-long campaign of murder, though some investigators believe the killing may have already started. He eventually established his own solo practice at 21 Market Street in 1993, becoming an even more respected figure in the community. His patients trusted him implicitly. He was their doctor, their confidant, and for the elderly women who lived alone in the surrounding streets, he was often the only person who visited them regularly. And that access, that trust, was exactly what Shipman exploited. His method was devastatingly simple, almost elegant in its cruelty. During routine house calls, Shipman would arrive at a patient's home with his medical bag, sit down beside them, and make pleasant conversation. He'd take their blood pressure, ask how they were feeling, and then, with the calm precision of a man performing a routine procedure, he would roll up their sleeve and inject them with a massive overdose of diamorphine, the pharmaceutical name for heroin. The drug would slow their breathing, lower their heart rate, and within minutes, they would be dead. They wouldn't cry out. They wouldn't struggle. They would simply drift away, as if falling asleep, while their trusted doctor sat beside them and watched. Shipman would then wait patiently in the room, sometimes for several minutes, before calling the family or an ambulance and delivering the tragic but seemingly unsurprising news that their loved one had passed. He would sign the death certificate himself, recording the cause of death as old age, heart disease, or natural causes. He would often falsify their medical records afterward, using his computerized system to backdate entries suggesting the patient had been in declining health for weeks or months, creating a paper trail that made the death look entirely expected. What he didn't realize, or perhaps didn't care about, was that his computer system recorded the time and date of every change, a digital fingerprint that would eventually betray him. He obtained his supply of diamorphine through an ingenious and diabolical method. He would overprescribe the drug to patients who genuinely needed it for pain management, sometimes ordering far more than any single patient could use, and then he would personally collect the excess from the pharmacy. This excess he would hoard, building a private stockpile that he used to prosecute his murders. On at least one occasion, he ordered 12,000 milligrams of diamorphine in the name of a single dying patient, a quantity that alone would have been sufficient to kill approximately 360 people. The sheer volume of controlled drugs passing through his hands should have triggered alarms, but the monitoring systems in place at the time were woefully inadequate. The statistics were staggering. A later analysis compared the death rates among Shipman's patients to those of similar practices in the area and found that his patients died at roughly 4 times the expected rate. Shipman was present at 19% of all deaths in his practice, compared to just 1% in comparable practices. Relatives and carers were far less likely to have been present when his patients died, and his patients' deaths clustered around a specific window of the day between 1 and 6 in the afternoon, when he typically conducted his home visits. 12% of his patients died around 2 in the afternoon alone, compared to just 2% in similar practices. But none of these red flags were noticed at the time, or if they were, they weren't acted upon. It wasn't until 1998 that the carefully constructed facade finally cracked, and it cracked because of greed. But it almost cracked earlier. In March 1998, Dr. Linda Reynolds, a general practitioner at a nearby surgery in Hyde, had grown uneasy about the sheer number of cremation forms she was being asked to countersign for Shipman's patients. An abnormally high proportion of them were elderly women, and the frequency of the requests was unlike anything she had encountered in her own career. She raised her concerns with John Pollard, the local coroner, who referred the matter to the Greater Manchester Police. But the police investigation that followed was brief and superficial. Unable to find sufficient evidence to bring charges, they closed the case on April 17, 1998, barely a month after it began. It was a catastrophic failure. In the months between the police closing their investigation and Shipman's eventual arrest, he killed 3 more people. Shipman's final victim was Kathleen Grundy, an 81-year-old former mayoress of Hyde, who was found dead at her home on June 24, 1998. She was a vibrant, active woman involved in charity work, and her sudden death caught everyone off guard. But it was what happened next that truly alarmed her family. A solicitor contacted Grundy's daughter, Angela Woodruff, who was herself a lawyer, informing her that a new will had surfaced, one that left Grundy's entire estate, valued at nearly £400,000, not to her family, but to Harold Shipman. Woodruff immediately recognized the document as a forgery and went straight to the police. When Grundy's body was exhumed, toxicology results revealed a massive amount of diamorphine in her system, enough to have killed her within hours of Shipman's last visit. Police then raided Shipman's home and seized his medical records, his computer, an odd collection of jewelry, and an old typewriter that was proven to be the instrument used to forge Grundy's will. The computer analysis was particularly damning. It showed that Shipman had altered patient records after their deaths, but the system's timestamps revealed exactly when those changes had been made, unraveling the web of fabricated medical histories he'd built. 15 cases were brought to trial, each one representing a life snuffed out by the man who was supposed to protect it. On January 31, 2000, after the jury deliberated for 6 days, Harold Shipman was found guilty on all 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery. He was sentenced to 15 concurrent life terms with a recommendation that he never be released. Throughout it all, Shipman denied everything. During police questioning, he sat with his eyes closed, yawned, and refused to look at photographs of his victims. He showed no remorse and offered no explanation. But 15 murders barely scratched the surface. In 2001, a government-ordered inquiry led by High Court Judge Dame Janet Smith began examining every death Shipman had certified over his career. The investigation reviewed 888 cases. When the final report was published in 2005, it concluded that Shipman had killed an estimated 250 people, beginning as early as 1971. Of the 215 confirmed unlawful killings, 171 were women and 44 were men. A further 45 deaths were deemed highly suspicious, and in 38 more, there simply wasn't enough evidence to reach a conclusion. Shipman may have been killing people for nearly 3 decades by the time he was caught, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history. His wife, Primrose, maintained his innocence throughout and visited him regularly in prison. On January 13, 2004, one day before his 58th birthday, Harold Shipman was found hanging from the window bars of his cell at Wakefield Prison, having used bedsheets tied to the bars. He had taken his own life, and in doing so, he took every answer with him. No confession, no explanation, no closure. The families of his victims were left with nothing but silence and a question that would echo for generations. Why? Some criminologists speculate that his mother's death played a role, that the image of a doctor administering morphine became seared into Shipman's psyche, and that he spent the rest of his career recreating that moment of ultimate power over life and death. Others suggest he simply enjoyed the control, the godlike ability to decide who lived and who died. Whatever the truth, Shipman's legacy reshaped British medicine in profound ways. His murders led to sweeping reforms in death certification, cremation practices, controlled drug monitoring, and the powers of the General Medical Council. The entire system had to be rebuilt because one man had exploited its every weakness for nearly 30 years. And while the people of Hyde and the United Kingdom were still reeling from the revelations about Harold Shipman, across the Atlantic, another medical professional had been leaving a trail of bodies from state to state, from country to country, and somehow, against all odds, kept getting hired. Michael Joseph Swango was born on October 21st, 1954, in Tacoma, Washington, and raised in Quincy, Illinois. He was the middle child of 3, born to Muriel and John Virgil Swango. His father was a decorated United States Army officer who served in Vietnam, but the war changed him. John Swango returned home a different man, hollowed out by what he had seen and increasingly consumed by alcoholism. He and Muriel divorced, and young Michael saw very little of his father after that. Instead, he grew up close to his mother, a pattern that some psychologists would later flag as significant in understanding what came next. On the surface, Swango was the kind of young man any parent would be proud of. He was the valedictorian of his high school class, an accomplished musician, and an athlete. He enrolled in college with the ambition of becoming a doctor, and eventually gained admission to Southern Illinois University's School of Medicine. But even in medical school, the mask occasionally slipped. His work was often sloppy and careless. He once mangled a cadaver so badly during anatomy lab that it became a running joke among students. He struggled with basic diagnostic tasks. But what truly unsettled his classmates was something harder to quantify: a disquieting energy that surrounded him, a fascination with death and violence that went beyond the professional curiosity expected of medical students. They gave him a nickname that was meant as a dark joke, but turned out to be horrifyingly accurate. They called him 00 Swango, a nod to James Bond's code number, because they said he seemed to have a license to kill. His classmates had no idea how right they were. Swango began his internship at Ohio State University Hospital in 1983, and almost immediately, patients started dying at an alarming rate. Nurses on the ward began noticing a pattern. Patients who had been stable, who were recovering, who had every reason to expect they'd be going home soon, would suddenly crash while under Swango's care. One nurse later told investigators she witnessed Swango injecting an unknown substance into a patient's intravenous line shortly before that patient stopped breathing. 5 deaths on the ward were linked to his shifts, and hospital administrators actually conducted interviews about the suspicious pattern. But astonishingly, the suspicions were dismissed. In fact, Ohio State University recommended Swango for medical licensure, and he completed his internship without being invited to stay for a residency, but with letters of recommendation in hand. In July 1984, Swango returned to Quincy, Illinois, and took a job as a paramedic with the Adams County Ambulance Corps. It was here that his poisoning habits extended beyond patients. On one occasion, he brought a bucket of fried chicken to his fellow paramedics. Several of them became violently ill afterward, with some vomiting so intensely that blood vessels in their eyes burst. On another occasion, he brought donuts and coffee, and once again, multiple co-workers fell sick. Colleagues began to suspect Swango was poisoning them. Police eventually searched his home and found what they described as a mini laboratory of poisons, including handwritten recipes for ricin, botulism, and supersaturated cyanide solutions. Prosecutors charged him with aggravated battery for poisoning his co-workers with arsenic, and in August 1985, he was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He served just 2. Now, you would think that a felony conviction for poisoning people would be the end of anyone's medical career. But the American healthcare system in the 1980s and 1990s was riddled with gaps, and Michael Swango was an expert at exploiting every single one of them. After his release from prison in 1987, Swango legally changed his name to Daniel J. Adams and began a campaign of identity fraud that would take him across the country and eventually around the world. He forged documents from the Illinois Department of Corrections to misrepresent his criminal record, fabricated a restoration of civil rights letter from a Virginia governor, and used these forged credentials to secure medical residencies at hospitals that never thought to dig deeper. In 1992, he began working at Sanford USD Medical Center in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and once again, patients began dying. When his criminal history was eventually discovered, he was fired. He then used yet another set of forged documents to secure a psychiatry residency at the State University of New York at Stony Brook, which placed him at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northport, Long Island. There, he murdered at least 3 patients: 73-year-old Thomas Samarco, 60-year-old George Ciano, and 62-year-old Aldo Serini. In at least 2 of these cases, he falsely told co-workers that the patients' families had issued "do not resuscitate" orders. He also paralyzed a patient named Baron Harris with an injection that was supposedly a sedative. Harris never regained consciousness and eventually died. When Stony Brook was finally tipped off about Swango's past in 1993, he was fired and effectively blacklisted in the United States. But instead of facing justice, he fled the country to Zimbabwe, where he forged yet more documents and secured a position as a physician at the Genene Lutheran Mission Hospital in Bulawayo. And like clockwork, patients there began dying under mysterious circumstances. Authorities in Zimbabwe eventually issued a warrant for his arrest, charging him with poisoning 7 patients, 5 of whom died. But Swango slipped away before he could be apprehended, and he next surfaced with a job offer from a hospital in Saudi Arabia. To take that job, however, he needed to pass through the United States for a visa. In June 1997, when he landed at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport, FBI agents were waiting. He was arrested on fraud charges for his false statements to Stony Brook and sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. Federal investigators used every second of that time to build a murder case against him, knowing that if they failed, Swango would be released and would almost certainly kill again. They exhumed the bodies of his victims from the Northport VA hospital and found poisonous chemicals in their remains. They also seized Swango's personal journals, which contained entries that chilled even the most hardened investigators. In page after page of cramped, deliberate handwriting, Swango poured out his deepest and most disturbing thoughts about the thrill of killing. He wrote about the joy and excitement he felt, describing the sweet, husky, close smell of an indoor homicide, and noting that murder was the only way he had of reminding himself that he was still alive. The journals painted a portrait of a man who didn't kill out of mercy or anger, but out of pure, self-indulgent pleasure. For Swango, the thrill was in the act itself, in the doing and the getting away with it. In July 2000, just days before he was scheduled for release, Swango was charged with 3 counts of murder. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He later pleaded guilty in Ohio to the 1984 murder of 19-year-old Cynthia McGee, a young woman who had been recovering from a bicycle accident at Ohio State University Hospital when Swango injected her with a lethal dose of potassium. He received a 4th consecutive life sentence. The FBI believes Swango may have been responsible for as many as 60 deaths. He is currently incarcerated at the ADX Florence Supermax facility in Colorado at his own request after being stabbed by another inmate while serving time at a previous facility. The case of Michael Swango remains one of the most damning indictments of institutional failure in American medical history. At every step, colleagues raised concerns, nurses reported suspicious behavior, and patients died under circumstances that defied explanation. And at every step, the system looked the other way. That same willingness to look away, to chalk up a pattern of suspicious deaths to bad luck or coincidence, played out with devastating consequences in northern Germany, where a young nurse turned the intensive care units of 2 hospitals into his personal arena of life and death. Niels Högel was born on December 30th, 1976, in the coastal town of Wilhelmshaven in Lower Saxony. Nursing was practically in his blood. His father worked as a nurse at the local St. Willehad hospital, and his grandmother had also been a nurse. After completing his vocational training at that same hospital in 1997, Högel followed the family tradition and became a nurse himself. By his own account, he had a sheltered childhood, free of violence, and there was nothing in his background that would suggest the horrors to come. In 1999, Högel was hired at the Klinikum Oldenburg, a large medical facility in the city of Oldenburg, where he was assigned to the cardiac surgery intensive care unit on Ward 211. It was a high-pressure environment, full of critically ill patients on ventilators and heart monitors, and it was in this setting that Högel discovered what would become his lethal obsession. He began injecting patients with massive overdoses of heart-stopping drugs, including adrenaline, sotalol, lidocaine, amiodarone, and calcium chloride. These medications, when administered in excessive quantities, would cause severe cardiac arrhythmia and catastrophic drops in blood pressure, sending patients into cardiac arrest. But here's the thing. Högel wasn't trying to kill them, or at least that's what he told himself. He wanted to bring them back. He craved the adrenaline rush of a code blue, the chaos of a resuscitation attempt, the feeling of being at the center of a life or death struggle where he could swoop in and be the hero. When it worked, when the patient's heart started beating again, Högel basked in the praise of his colleagues. Some of them even gave him a nickname that would take on a grim irony: Resuscitation Rambo. But the human heart is not a toy, and more often than not, the patients he poisoned never woke up. The pattern of deaths at the Oldenburg Clinic spiked dramatically during Högel's tenure, but somehow the institution failed to connect the dots. In fact, in October 2002, the clinic's director of nursing issued Högel a glowing reference letter, praising his circumspect, diligent, and autonomous work ethic, and commending his devotedness and cooperative conduct. The letter described his overall performance as completed to the utmost satisfaction. Armed with that recommendation, Högel transferred to the Josef Hospital in Delmenhorst in December 2002, and within a week of starting his new job, patients began dying again. At Delmenhorst, the death toll climbed even faster. Emergencies and fatalities on Högel's shifts, particularly from arrhythmia and sudden drops in blood pressure, spiked to levels that even the most inattentive observer should have noticed. Some of Högel's co-workers did grow suspicious and began distancing themselves from him. But still, no one went to the police. The hospital's internal structures failed at every level. Administrators either didn't see the pattern or chose to ignore it. It wasn't until June 2005 that Högel was finally caught in the act. A colleague walked in on him injecting an unprescribed dose of adrenaline into a patient's veins. The patient died the following day, but shockingly, no one at the hospital alerted the police for another 2 days. When law enforcement finally became involved, Högel was arrested and charged. In 2008, he was convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 7.5 years in prison. During that trial, he admitted to intentionally inducing cardiac arrest in roughly 90 patients at the Delmenhorst Hospital alone. But the real scale of his crimes wouldn't become clear for years. In 2014, prompted by the admissions Högel had made during his initial trial and by pressure from victims' families, police launched a massive reinvestigation. The Special Commission, codenamed Cardio, spent 3 years combing through more than 500 patient files and hundreds of hospital records from both facilities where Högel had worked. They exhumed 134 bodies from 67 different cemeteries across Germany, Poland, and Turkey. In many cases, decomposition had progressed too far to detect traces of medication. Making matters worse, 101 patients from the Delmenhorst Hospital who had died during Högel's tenure had been cremated, destroying any chance of forensic evidence. But in the bodies that could be tested, investigators found the telltale signatures of the cardiac drugs Högel had used. The second trial began in October 2018 at the Weseremshallen Ballrooms in Oldenburg, a venue chosen because no courtroom in the region was large enough to accommodate the 126 co-plaintiffs and their families. Högel was charged with 100 counts of murder. During the proceedings, he confessed to 43 of the killings, but claimed he couldn't remember the other 52. Some of his victims had been on the path to recovery, nowhere near death's door, when Högel decided to use them as props in his grotesque game of cardiac roulette. On June 6, 2019, Högel was found guilty of 85 murders and sentenced to life in prison. The presiding judge, Sebastian Bjurman, addressed Högel directly, telling him that his guilt was unimaginable and that the human mind struggles to take in the sheer scale of his crimes. But even 85 convictions may not tell the full story. Police believe that Högel may have claimed as many as 300 victims during his 5 years of killing, which would make him not just Germany's most prolific serial killer in peacetime, but potentially one of the most prolific in the entire world. The case also sparked intense scrutiny of the hospitals that employed him, with investigators questioning how 2 separate institutions could have failed so completely. Several former administrators and doctors from both the Oldenburg and Delmenhorst hospitals faced legal proceedings for their failure to act on the warning signs. The Oldenburg clinic had essentially handed a killer nurse to another hospital with a letter of praise, and the Delmenhorst hospital had allowed the deaths to continue for years without contacting the police. The families of Högel's victims were left to grapple not only with the loss of their loved ones, but with the infuriating knowledge that many of those deaths could have been prevented if a single person in authority had possessed the courage to speak up. While Europe was grappling with the scope of Niels Högel's crimes, the United States had already produced its own long-running nightmare in the form of a hospital orderly who killed for nearly 2 decades and called himself an angel. Donald Harvey was born on April 15, 1952, in Hamilton, Ohio, the oldest of 3 children born to Ray and Goldie Harvey. Shortly after his birth, the family relocated to Boonville, Kentucky, a tiny community nestled in the Appalachian Mountains where his parents scraped by as struggling tobacco farmers. Former classmates remembered Harvey as a loner and a teacher's pet, a quiet boy who rarely participated in activities and instead spent most of his time reading books. He earned decent grades in high school without much effort, but eventually grew bored with the routine and dropped out. With no real direction, Harvey drifted for a while before settling in Cincinnati, Ohio, where he found work at a factory. When the factory work dried up, his mother called and asked him to visit his ailing grandfather at Marymount Hospital in London, Kentucky. That visit in 1970 would change the trajectory of Harvey's life and end the lives of dozens of people. Harvey took a job at Marymount as an orderly, and it was there, at the age of just 18, that he committed his first murder. His victim was 88-year-old Logan Evans, an incontinent stroke patient who had smeared feces on Harvey during a routine bed change. In a fit of rage, Harvey grabbed a pillow and smothered the old man to death. He later claimed that the killing was an act of mercy, that Evans was suffering and needed to be put out of his misery, but the truth was far simpler and far uglier. Harvey later admitted that many of his early killings were driven not by compassion, but by anger. Over the next 10 months at Marymount, Harvey killed at least a dozen more patients, smothering some, disconnecting the oxygen tanks of others, and experimenting with various poisons. All of his victims were cardiac patients, and their deaths were routinely attributed to their existing conditions. No one questioned why so many patients were dying under the care of the new orderly. When suspicions did eventually arise, Marymount Hospital handled the situation in the worst possible way. Harvey was quietly asked to resign. No criminal investigation was launched, no police were called, and no warning was passed along to any future employer. After leaving Marymount, Harvey drifted through various jobs before landing at the Cincinnati Veterans Administration Medical Center in 1975, where he worked as a housekeeping aide and later as a nursing assistant. The VA hospital became his killing ground for the next decade, and it was here that Harvey truly evolved as a predator. He killed an estimated 15 more patients during this period, experimenting with a ghoulish array of methods and poisons. He refined his techniques by studying medical journals during his off hours, poring over toxicology reports and pharmacological texts to learn which substances would kill most effectively while leaving the fewest traces. He experimented with a grim pharmacopoeia: cyanide, arsenic, rat poison, and cleaning chemicals smuggled from hospital supply closets. Sometimes he would simply smother patients with their own pillows or turn off their oxygen supply and walk away. Other times, he would tamper with their intravenous lines, replacing their medications with lethal doses of whatever he had on hand. He targeted patients who were already frail or chronically ill, betting correctly that their deaths would raise no eyebrows. After all, people die in hospitals every day, and few questioned why a cardiac patient or a terminally ill veteran had passed away during the night. Harvey's co-workers at the VA sometimes joked about how many patients seemed to die on his shifts, but no one ever connected the dots. In 1985, as he was leaving work one evening, security guards noticed something odd about Harvey's behavior and searched the gym bag he was carrying. Inside, they found a .38 caliber handgun, hypodermic needles, surgical scissors and gloves, a cocaine spoon, and various books on the occult. It was a deeply alarming discovery, one that should have triggered a full-scale investigation into the man carrying it. But incredibly, Harvey was simply given the option to resign quietly. No criminal investigation was launched, no law enforcement was notified, and no alert was sent to future employers. The pattern of institutional cowardice that protected killers like Harvey continued unbroken. In February 1986, Harvey began working at Drake Memorial Hospital in Cincinnati, and he wasted no time settling back into his lethal routine. Over the next year and a half, he killed at least 21 more patients. His co-workers at Drake noticed his odd behavior. He told crude jokes about death, and after a patient on his ward would die, he'd smirk and tell the nurses he had gotten rid of another one for them. Colleagues found him so unsettling that they would leave the break room when he sat down. He reportedly stole tissue samples from the hospital morgue and kept a detailed diary of his crimes, including dates, methods, and the names of his victims, hidden behind a mirror in his bathroom. Harvey's downfall came in 1987 when a patient named John Powell, a man who had been hospitalized after a motorcycle accident and was expected to make a full recovery, suddenly died. During the autopsy, the pathologist detected the distinctive bitter almond scent of cyanide coming from Powell's stomach cavity. The investigation that followed quickly led to Harvey. His apartment was searched, and investigators found cyanide, arsenic, medical equipment, and the handwritten diary. He was arrested, and what followed was one of the most chilling confessions in criminal history. Harvey sat down with investigators, and over the course of 12 hours, calmly recounted the details of 33 murders, a number that would eventually grow. He described the killings with the casual ease of someone recounting a trip to the grocery store. One prosecutor remarked that Harvey discussed the details like he would tell you he had gone out to get a sandwich for lunch. Harvey's defense attorney, recognizing that Ohio law allowed prosecutors to seek the death penalty for multiple murders, negotiated a plea bargain. In exchange for taking execution off the table, Harvey would confess to every killing and accept a de facto life sentence. In August 1987, Harvey pleaded guilty to 24 counts of murder in Ohio. That November, he pleaded guilty to 9 more killings, including 8 murders and 1 manslaughter at Marymount Hospital in Kentucky. In total, Donald Harvey was convicted of 37 murders, though he later claimed his true victim count was 70, or even as high as 87. He chuckled when a list of his victims' names was displayed in court. He showed no remorse, and psychiatric evaluations concluded that he was sane, competent, and a compulsive killer who built up tension in his body and released it by taking lives. Harvey spent 3 decades in prison. On March 28, 2017, he was found badly beaten in his cell at the Toledo Correctional Institution. He died 2 days later at the age of 64. A fellow inmate named James Elliott was later charged with his murder. Elliott claimed he was acting as a vigilante, that he had grown up near the families of Harvey's Kentucky victims and wanted to give them closure. The prosecutor assigned to Harvey's murder noted the grim irony, saying that Harvey had died the same way he'd killed so many others, helplessly, in an institutional bed, at the hands of someone he should have been able to trust. While Donald Harvey was poisoning patients in the heartland of America, thousands of miles away in the quiet fjords of Norway, another killer was exploiting the trust placed in him by the most vulnerable members of society. Arnfinn Nesset was born on October 25, 1936, in Trøndelag, Norway. He was raised by his mother alone, having been born out of wedlock. His father was absent from his life entirely, and Nesset never sought to establish contact with him. He lived with his mother at her childhood home for most of his life, and eventually trained as a registered nurse, a respected profession in a country that prides itself on its social welfare system and its care for the elderly. In 1977, at the age of 41, Nesset was hired as the head nurse and manager of the Orkdal Valley Nursing Home, a geriatric care facility in the municipality of Orkdal in central Norway. The nursing home was, by all appearances, a quiet, well-run institution devoted to caring for elderly residents in the final years of their lives. Nesset was described as soft-spoken, bespectacled, and calm, hardly the image of a killer. But behind that unassuming exterior, Nesset was harboring something far darker. Beginning in May 1977, Nesset started killing residents of the nursing home using succinylmethonium chloride, sold under the brand name Curacet. This drug is a potent muscle relaxant used in medical settings to temporarily paralyze patients, typically during surgery. In normal doses, its effects are controlled and temporary, but in the quantities Nesset was administering, it induced rapid paralysis of the respiratory muscles, causing his victims to suffocate to death, often within minutes. He administered the drug either by direct injection or, in some cases, by mixing it into his patients' food or beverages. His victims ranged in age from 67 to 95, people who had been entrusted to his care, people whose families believed they were safe. The drug had one particular property that made it nearly perfect for murder. It degraded rapidly in the body after death, leaving almost no detectable trace. This meant that even if a death seemed sudden or unexpected, there was little reason for anyone to suspect foul play, and autopsies, when performed at all, rarely found anything unusual. To make matters worse, many of Nesset's victims were subsequently cremated, completely destroying any remaining evidence. The deaths were consistently attributed to the natural decline of elderly patients, and for years, no one thought to question that explanation. The killing continued for more than 3 years, during which time the death rate at the Orkdal nursing home climbed to levels that far exceeded what would be expected at a facility of its size. A total of 60 suspicious deaths were investigated during this period, though the actual number could be much higher. Some investigators believe that Nesset may have been responsible for as many as 138 deaths over his career. The chief prosecutor at his trial described him as an ambitious man who wanted complete control over life and death. It was a local journalist who first noticed something was wrong. In late 1980, this reporter, investigating the unusually high death rate at the Orkdal facility, discovered that the nursing home had been ordering large quantities of Curacet, far more than would ever be needed for routine medical procedures at a geriatric facility. The discovery prompted authorities to take a closer look, and when the investigation revealed just how abnormal the mortality figures were, police were called in. Nesset was arrested in January 1981. Under initial questioning, he confessed to the murders of 27 patients, later increasing that number to 30 in some accounts, explaining in matter-of-fact detail how he had injected them with succinylmethonium chloride, or mixed the drug into their food. But before the trial began, Nesset retracted his entire confession and denied all charges. He maintained his innocence throughout the trial, which commenced on October 18, 1982, at the Frostating Court of Appeal in Trondheim. The proceedings lasted approximately 5 months, making it one of the longest criminal trials in Norwegian history at the time. The court heard testimony from 123 witnesses, and 4 psychiatrists unanimously declared Nesset sane and fit to stand trial. The prosecution faced enormous challenges. Because so many of the victims had been cremated, there was little physical evidence to work with. The characteristics of succinylmethonium chloride made detection nearly impossible, even in the bodies that could be examined. The drug breaks down rapidly after death into naturally occurring compounds, meaning that by the time anyone thought to look for it, the chemical evidence had often disappeared entirely. Instead, prosecutors relied on medical records, drug purchase documentation, and witness testimony to establish the pattern of deaths and Nesset's role in them. They meticulously traced the nursing home's orders of Karacit, demonstrating that the quantities purchased far exceeded anything that could be justified for legitimate medical purposes. Nesset had claimed the large shipments were needed for euthanizing stray pets, a flimsy excuse that collapsed under scrutiny. The court ultimately convicted Nesset of murdering 22 patients with succinylmethonium chloride, along with one count of attempted murder. He was acquitted on 2 other counts due to insufficient evidence. He was sentenced to 21 years in prison, the maximum term available under Norwegian law at the time, to be followed by 10 years of preventative detention. However, the Norwegian justice system operates differently from that of many other countries, and Nesset was released after serving just 12 years for good behavior. He was then placed on 10 years of supervised release and reportedly relocated to an undisclosed location under an assumed name. In recent years, questions arose about whether Nesset's case may represent a wrongful conviction. A book published in 2025 titled The Unlikely Serial Killer Arnfinn Nesset and His 31 Confessions by Detective Simon Sætre suggested the case might be Norway's most significant wrongful conviction. Nesset himself told Norwegian media that he believed he had been coerced into confessing, saying he remembered well that he confessed, but that police had threatened to exhume the bodies if he didn't take responsibility, and that he thought it would be better if he just took it upon himself. Nesset died at a nursing home on December 2nd, 2025, at the age of 89, and whatever the full truth of his case may be, it died with him. From the frozen landscapes of Norway to the sweltering heat of South Texas, the same nightmare played out with an even more heartbreaking twist, because the victims this time were not elderly patients at the end of their lives. They were babies. Genene Jones was born on July 13, 1950, in San Antonio, Texas. She was adopted as an infant by Richard Jefferson Jones and his wife Gladys, and she grew up in the San Antonio area, attending John Marshall High School. Her early life was marked by tragedy. Her favorite brother died in a freak accident, and her adoptive father succumbed to cancer. Those who knew her described her as someone with a tendency toward pathological lying and a need for attention that bordered on desperate. She once told a boyfriend she was pregnant when she wasn't. She accused her husband of abuse without evidence. She craved the spotlight, and she would go to extraordinary lengths to stand in it, even if it meant destroying innocent lives to get there. In 1977, Jones completed her training as a licensed vocational nurse and was hired at Behar County Hospital in San Antonio, where she was assigned to the pediatric intensive care unit. Her supervisor noticed almost immediately that Jones caused problems among her coworkers. She was overbearing, controlling, and constantly sought to be at the center of every crisis. But she was also passionate about her work with children, and she fought fiercely to be taken seriously in a ward dominated by registered nurses who outranked her. It didn't take long for the nightmares to begin. During a 15-month period between April 1981 and June 1982, the 8-bed pediatric intensive care unit at Behar County Hospital experienced a devastating epidemic of death. 42 children died in the unit, an extraordinarily high number for a ward of that size. Even more disturbing was the pattern. 34 of those deaths occurred during the 3 to 11 p.m. shift, and Jones had been the assigned nurse for 20 of them. Babies who had been stable, who were recovering, who should have been getting better, would suddenly crash without explanation. Their hearts would stop. They would have seizures. They would stop breathing. Intravenous lines would inexplicably go haywire, and children pricked with needles would begin bleeding uncontrollably, as if their clotting mechanisms had simply vanished. The staff began to call Jones's shift the death shift. Nurses whispered to each other in hallways and cafeterias, trading stories about what was happening on her watch. In October 1981, a registered nurse named Susanna Maldonado walked into the office of the ICU's head nurse, Pat Belko, and told her directly, "Too many babies are dying, and they are dying under the care of Genene Jones." Maldonado had studied the ICU's census book, tracking which patients had died during which shifts, and the data painted a damning picture. But Belko dismissed her concerns as gossip. The hospital did eventually conduct an internal investigation, but it was hamstrung by the administration's fear of lawsuits and bad publicity. The committee that investigated acknowledged that Jones was the primary target of suspicion, but could not prove wrongdoing beyond a reasonable doubt. Rather than firing Jones outright, which might invite a discrimination lawsuit, the hospital chose a cowardly half measure. They restructured the ICU to replace all licensed vocational nurses with registered nurses, effectively pushing Jones out without directly accusing her, and then, in an act of institutional negligence that would cost more children their lives, the hospital sent Jones on her way with a warm letter of recommendation, calling her loyal, dependable, trustworthy, and an asset. The letter specifically noted that the staffing change in no way reflected on her performance. With that letter in hand, Jones secured a position at the brand new pediatric clinic of Dr. Kathleen Holland in Kerrville, Texas, a small town about 60 miles northwest of San Antonio. Holland had been warned by at least one colleague to reconsider hiring Jones, but she didn't believe the rumors. In Holland's eyes, Jones was a dedicated nurse who cared deeply about her patients. The pattern resumed almost immediately. Within a single month, 7 of Holland's patients experienced 8 separate medical emergencies in which children stopped breathing during what should have been routine office visits. The children would go limp, turn blue, and stop responding, only for Jones to leap into action, barking orders and inserting IVs, playing the role of the heroic nurse fighting to save a dying child. On September 17, 1982, the game reached its tragic conclusion. Patty McClellan brought her 15-month-old daughter Chelsea to Holland's office for a routine checkup and immunizations. Chelsea was a beautiful, blue-eyed little girl who had been developing normally and had no serious health concerns. Holland asked Jones to give the girl her shots. According to Patty McClellan, she was holding Chelsea in her arms, the baby facing her, when Jones plunged the needle into Chelsea's left thigh. Immediately, the child began having trouble breathing. Chelsea tried to say her mother's name but couldn't form the word. Her tiny body began convulsing violently. An ambulance was called to the office, and as the paramedics loaded Chelsea into the vehicle, Jones climbed in with them, cradling the child she had just poisoned. On the ambulance ride to a San Antonio hospital, Chelsea suffered 2 cardiac arrests. She was placed in the intensive care unit, where medical staff fought desperately to save her, but the damage was too severe. Chelsea Ann McClellan died, and the investigation into her death would expose a horror that had been festering for years. An autopsy detected traces of succinylcholine, a powerful muscle relaxant that paralyzes the respiratory system in Chelsea's body, a drug that had absolutely no business being anywhere near a healthy 15-month-old receiving routine immunizations. Dr. Holland herself had become suspicious after finding unexplained puncture marks in a vial of succinylcholine in her office's medication supply. The investigation that followed revealed that Jones had been injecting children with this drug and others, including digoxin and heparin, to induce life-threatening emergencies she could then heroically attempt to resolve. Jones was arrested, and in February 1984, she was convicted of murdering Chelsea McClellan and sentenced to 99 years in prison. She also received a concurrent 60-year sentence for nearly killing 4-week-old Rolando Santos with repeated overdoses of the blood thinner heparin. Prosecutors believe Jones was responsible for between 11 and 46 infant deaths at Behar County Hospital alone, with the full number potentially reaching as many as 60 children. But gathering evidence proved extraordinarily difficult. Some hospital records from Jones's time at Behar County may have been deliberately destroyed, and many of her tiny victims had been laid to rest without the kind of forensic examination that might have revealed the truth. For decades, the case seemed closed. But in 2013, families of Jones's victims learned to their horror that she was on track for mandatory release in March 2018, thanks to an old Texas law designed to relieve prison overcrowding. The prospect of Jones walking free sent shockwaves through the community. Petty McClellan, Chelsea's mother, who had become a nurse herself in the years since her daughter's death, led a public campaign to keep Jones behind bars. A grown-up Rolando Santos made television appearances, showing the needle scars from the bleeding episodes that nearly killed him as an infant. Behar County District Attorney Nico LaHood responded by forming a task force in 2015 to reinvestigate the cold cases. In 2017, a grand jury indicted Jones for the murders of 5 additional babies: 11-month-old Joshua Earl Sawyer, 2-year-old Rosemary Vega, 8-month-old Richard Nelson, 4-month-old Patrick Zavala, and 3-month-old Paul Edward Villarreal. Jones initially pleaded not guilty, but in January 2020, just weeks before she was scheduled to go to trial, she accepted a plea deal and pleaded guilty to the murder of Joshua Sawyer, who had been recovering from smoke inhalation at Behar County's pediatric ICU when he died from a massive overdose of seizure medication in December 1981. She was sentenced to life in prison, with no parole eligibility for at least 20 years. At Jones's sentencing, the judge addressed her directly, telling her that she had taken God's most precious gift and turned it into a weapon. Petty McClellan, who had fought for almost 4 decades for justice, finally stood in a courtroom and looked into the eyes of the woman who had killed her daughter. Jones, now in her 70s, remains incarcerated in a Texas prison, showing little apparent remorse for the unimaginable pain she inflicted on dozens of families whose only crime was trusting a nurse with the lives of their children. These 6 stories, spanning decades and continents, share a single, terrifying thread. In every case, the killer hid behind a uniform, a title, or a badge of trust. They exploited the most vulnerable people in the most vulnerable moments of their lives. And in every case, the systems that were supposed to protect patients failed catastrophically. Colleagues who raised alarms were ignored or dismissed. Administrators who suspected wrongdoing chose silence over scandal. Institutions that should have called the police instead wrote letters of recommendation and quietly shuffled the problem down the road to the next unsuspecting hospital or clinic. And the people who paid the ultimate price were the ones who had no power to protect themselves: the elderly, the sick, the recovering, and the newborn. The trust we place in medical professionals is perhaps the deepest form of trust we offer to any stranger. And these cases remind us, in the most painful way possible, how devastating the betrayal of that trust can be. If any of these stories resonated with you, or if they've left you thinking about the power of trust and the devastating consequences when that trust is broken, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the like button. Your support helps us continue telling these stories, the ones that need to be heard, the ones that remind us to stay vigilant, and the ones that honor the memories of those who deserve so much better. Until next time, stay safe.